We have with us Kwami Coleman, who will be presenting jazz fusion or jazz as fusion.
Before we go any further, I just kind of want to introduce these fantastic musicians that I've had the pleasure to work with. We have the amazing bassist, Jeff Chambers. To my farther right, we have Eddie Marshall on drums. And then we have Anthony Diamond on alto saxophone. So, the title, Jazz Fusion or Jazz as Fusion, right? So like, you know, so it implies an either or kind of situation, right? Either you have jazz fusion or jazz as fusion. What I hope to explain to you today is that the answer is really actually both, right? But with several caveats, provisos, and exceptions to the rule. I want to suggest three things. First is jazz as a musical tradition is nothing if not one of stylistic fusion. That is to say, jazz from its very beginnings in the late 19th and early 20th century flourished as a fusion of different styles of music from the United States, Caribbean, and Europe, primarily by musicians of African descent in cities like New Orleans, Chicago, Kansas City, San Francisco, and New York City. Stylistic fusion has remained as a fundamental aspect of jazz since then. I think that's pretty straightforward, and I think we all might agree with that. The second thing I want to suggest throughout the length of the presentation today is the term jazz fusion, in scare quotes here, is a historical term, one that points to a specific era in jazz history compiled by critics and historians that encapsulates the attitudes and the musical aesthetics of different musicians, different critics, and listeners and audiences in the 1970s. It is a concept that some use and agree with, and others do not use and do not agree with. So it's more conceptual. Lastly, jazz as fusion, and not necessarily jazz fusion, the term, is still alive today. We can find it perhaps most prominently in the fusion of jazz and hip-hop by contemporary musicians, and we'll talk more about that later. Okay, so now that we have some sound in our ears, let's actually talk a little more about the term jazz fusion itself, because this is of course what, even if we know a lot about jazz history or know little of, something that I'm sure we've heard somewhere down the line. At some point in jazz history, jazz interacts with rock and roll, funk, and soul. And if we know a little more, we know that some people had a real serious problem with that. We know that other people really went along with that. So let's try to get to the bottom of it. Miles Davis' second great quintet of the 1960s with Wayne Shorter, Herbie Hancock, Ron Carter, Tony Williams. Who knows this group? Yes. Now, yeah, all the hands should be going up. Homework. This is homework. This group would lay the groundwork for what would be known as jazz fusion in the 70s. And this is interesting because if you know about this group, they were a mostly acoustic group that played really abstract, music that was labeled post-bop. They really tried not to call it anything. But this group really did lay the foundation for what would become known as fusion. So now why? Well, let's take a look at the quintet studio album Miles in the Sky of 1968. It features Herbie Hancock making the move from acoustic piano to electric piano. And with tunes on the album like Country Sun and Stuff, an undeniable rock, funk, and soul influence is heard, is evident. An even earlier example of this type of fusion can be heard in Herbie Hancock's soul-infused Cantaloupe Island of 1964. Who knows this tune? Cantaloupe Island. Good. And Watermelon Man. Yeah. How many people know Watermelon Man? Yes. So now Herbie originally recorded that as a kind of straight ahead tune, but it was re-recorded by someone else that made it, into this funky Latin boogaloo record. Who was that person? Who knows? Any guesses? The Cuban conguero Mongo Santa Maria. Yeah, that's right. So, here, if we venture into our more in-depth look into jazz fusion, we should rightfully and accurately begin with Davis's 1960s quintet for two reasons. Number one, upon the dissolution of the group in late 1968, each of the band members would continue in the multiple innovative musical directions versioned by the quintet over their 4 years in existence. So Herbie Hancock would go on to create the group Wandishi, or he would call himself Wandishi, and base a group around that. And then later on, Headhunters. How many people know Headhunters? Right? That's right. Ron Carter would just go on to become one of the most prolific musicians in the 70s, period. He's on just too many recordings to count.